You know, at the Center for the Study of Sport and Society, we see sport playing a unique role in society and being the great common denominator that can bring people together. And it's amazing to us, given some of the work that we currently do with gender violence prevention education and diversity and conflict resolution, that some of the same themes that you'll see in the clip tonight that have been played out already in the clip are still at work today. The issues of power and control in regards to relationships, the issues of masculinity in our society and how it gets defined are all the things that you'll see on display in the next 45 minutes. So on behalf of our distinguished panelists that I'll introduce after this piece, and again on behalf of my colleagues at Sport and Society, Northeastern University, and our partners this evening, I want to thank you for being here, for participating, and we look forward to the dialogue after the clip. Thanks very much. I'll introduce each of our panelists, and then they will take about 5 minutes to share some thoughts about this complex individual, Jack Johnson. After each of our panelists have had a chance to share their thoughts and remarks, we'll give the audience an opportunity to participate with some question and answer. First, I'd like to introduce Robin Chandler. Professor Chandler is the Director of Women's Studies at Northeastern University and a sociologist by education. Second, Ron Borges, 22 years a sports reporter with the Boston Globe. Ron has covered multiple sports about boxing, but boxing remains his first love. And Professor Robert L. Hall, Professor of African American Studies and History here at Northeastern University, and refuses to tell me what the L stands for. So, Professor Chandler.
Hi, I hope everyone enjoyed the film as much as we did. I wanted to start off just by talking about Jack Johnson from a cultural perspective. I mean, Jack Johnson is every bit the individual that Stanley Crouch mentions in the film, but I like to think of him in some ways compared to some of the cultural heroes of our time, and so I think of him very much in terms of the bling-blinger of the beginning years of the 20th century. I mean, he's the bad boy, the defiant man who is creating a new sense of black manhood. And I kind of think of that commercial sometimes, what becomes a legend most. And what becomes a legend most in the case of Jack Johnson is that he comes at a time in history when scientific racism is making a case about the inferiority of peoples of African descent and colored peoples in general. It's a time just before World War I, and so Jack Johnson comes on the American horizon, the American cultural landscape, just as America is beginning to develop an identity as a real international player in many respects. And I'm not going to say too much more because I probably could talk for a very long time. All of us could, but I know that a lot of you want to jump in and ask questions and make comments. And so I'm not going to hoard the mic and say too much more, but pass it on to my colleague.
From a boxing standpoint, Jack Johnson remains, in the opinion of most people, one of the 6 to 10 greatest heavyweight champions ever. Some people would still argue that he was the greatest heavyweight champion ever. But he spawned through his will and through his skill the creation of a sad concept which persists, which is that of the Great White Hope. I think people today might have a tendency to watch this film and come away and sort of shake their heads and say, oh, what a terrible people they were back then, and how could newspapers write some of the things they said, and how could people think that way. And I'm here to tell you that almost 80 years later, I covered Larry Holmes, who was then the heavyweight champion of the world and is also one of the 10 great heavyweights of all time, in my opinion, fight at the time the latest Great White Hope, Jerry Cooney. and all the virulent feelings exhibited there, although somewhat more masked, existed at that time. Jerry Cooney was on the cover of Time magazine. Larry Holmes was the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. Larry Holmes' home was invaded. His mailbox was blown up, and the only difference is later it came to light that the people who paid to have that done was the promoter, Don King, who was a black man and who understood business probably better than anybody. So although we have done a good job, I think, in sports in particular of sort of bridging some of these things and giving opportunities when the rest of society was not ready to, things have not changed quite as much as we would hope. Thanks.
Good evening. I've never told people my name and said hello in less than 50 minutes, so I don't know what I can do in 5. I want to try to continue the historical contextualization. Jack Johnson was born in 1878, the year after President Rutherford B. Hayes pulled out the federal troops from the former Confederate states. That was part of the so-called Compromise of 1877, which resolved a disputed election, presidential election, that's reminiscent of 2000, in that one of the 3 states where the ballots were contested was Florida, my home state, which has never in its entire history gotten the ballots counted properly. And then Jack turned pro in 1897, the year after the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court, which said that separate facilities were okay as long as they were equal. But in reality, the emphasis was always on separate and virtually never on equal, in terms of equal funding for education, quality of materials that went into the building of schools, you name it. At a time when there were publicly funded high schools in black for whites in a certain district, the highest that blacks could go in publicly funded schools was 8th grade. And if they wanted to go beyond that, they had to pack up and go to boarding school, which in fact is what my mother did during Johnson's lifetime. She was born the year he won the championship. And my father was born the year he won the championship. Then there are a number of other things, but the 1908 year when the Sydney, Australia fight, that was also the year of Springfield, Illinois race riot. Now people were used to, Americans, black and white, were used to race riots, and they were used to lynchings, but some viewed that as a Southern problem. And it stuck in a lot of liberals and socialists and neo-abolitionists' craw that this riot in Springfield in 1908 happened in the land of Lincoln, the great emancipator. And it was actually the riot that spurred the calling of a conference which ultimately resulted in the establishment of the NAACP. And a year or so after, the National Urban League, with a slightly different specialization, was founded. So those are some of the contextual things. Then on a personal note, my father was a boxer, not of that same generation, but I'm sure that he grew up seeing the film fights, and usually, especially in the South, the newsreels and the football snippets that you got were like from 10, 15 years ago. So in 1955, we were watching the 1945 Rose Bowl game. And Johnson also shows up in folklore, or at least inspires folklore. People think of Jack Johnson when they think of the story of Shine and the Titanic, because people knew that with all of his money, Jack Johnson had trouble getting first-class accommodations on ocean liners, and he had some trouble in some European countries getting into hotels. And so that was the comeuppance. The rest of everybody else on the ship sank, and Shine, read Jack, swam all the way back to the United States. And a few minutes later, the Titanic had sunk, and Shine was standing on Broadway, 1/3 drunk. And I imagine Jack Johnson was 1/3 drunk many times when he was off duty. That's all I have to say.
We'd like to open it up for questions from the audience and encourage folks to ask the panelists some questions and perspectives. I'm sure they'll have plenty to say. We have microphones down here at the front of the auditorium, so please feel free to come down. Yes, sir.
Hello. I was wondering if any of you can draw any parallels or differences between Jack Johnson sort of breaking the color barrier his way versus Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball, and with some aid, shall we say. I see some parallels and I see some differences. I just wonder if you have any comments about that.
Well, I think one of the real differences was, Jackie Robinson was very carefully selected by Branch Rickey, as much for his willingness at that time to sort of patiently endure that which Jack Johnson would never have endured for one moment. What allowed Jack Johnson, that's one of the things I love about boxing, what allowed Jack Johnson to emerge was that in the end, in boxing, it is always about you and someone else and nobody else. And so he was able, although it took him many years, to finally get the opportunity, whereas Jackie Robinson could have never gotten that opportunity without Branch Rickey and a lot of other people. What Jack Johnson established was, I'm going to beat all these guys, and I'm going to chase Jim Jeffries all over the world, which he did, and ultimately I'm going to beat somebody and get an opportunity where now you're going to have to deal with me. And that's what happened. Was in Robinson's case, he had to at least initially be far quieter about things than Jack Johnson ever would have been.
I think from a cultural standpoint, I just want to add that one of the other differences, obviously, beyond the notion that Jackie Robinson was selected, is that Jack Johnson is a nonconformist, and he doesn't conform to the social type that was being promoted by white America. What's ironic about that is someone like Babe Ruth, who was a contemporary of his, was every bit the Lothario with women. He was just as flamboyant and outrageous and self-involved. But he's not subjected to the sort of prejudice, of course, that JJ is subjected to. And so he's very much the individual who's not the social type. And Jackie Robinson is. He's the type of black man that America is willing to accept as a superior athlete, as long as he stays in his place.
Clearly, race is a social construct that changes over time, so that who is white is continually evolving. So I was wondering, back then, did Southern European immigrants and Central European immigrants, such as Italians, who are not really considered white, how they reacted to Jack Johnson? I also wondered if W.E.B. Du Bois commented on Jack Johnson's triumph.
I don't know whether Jack Johnson's trial was commented on by Du Bois. That's something I'd have to go look up in the Crisis magazine, because Du Bois was still editing the Crisis until about 1934, when he parted ways with the NAACP. On the immigration question, many immigrant groups from Europe are not white until they get to the United States. And part of becoming an American is to become white, not just in skin color, but to recognize who's on top and who's on the bottom. And you know, the one thing you know is you don't want to be black. And people weren't so sure about the Italians. You know, during World War I, speaking of pseudoscientific racialism, as Robin Chandler was speaking, during World War I, as part of the process of screening soldiers for the American Army, they developed they adapted Binet's intelligence test, and they administered as the Army Alpha and Beta test. And then they reported the results by ethnic group. And next, just a notch above the Negro, was the Italian. And the debates over immigration restriction laws that established the quotas in 1924, one of the big debates was which census are we going to use as the basis for determining the quota. Initially, I think somebody had proposed 1900 or 1910. And then they said, well, wait a minute, though. The 1890s was the decade for the wave or the flood of Italian immigration. So we better push this baseline back to the 1890 census. So that's part of the answer. Being, you know, these guys, a lot of these prize fighters were either Irish or French Canadian. Tommy Burns, that wasn't his real name, you'll discover when you see the film. And that's part of the assimilation process in the United States.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that, because you hit upon something that's intrigued me for a long time. I've been around boxing since I was a kid, 8 or 9 years old, in one way or another. And I've always have believed for a long time that you can trace the immigration and the absorption rate in American society through boxing better than any other thing you can find, because whoever was on the bottom produced the great boxing champions. There were great Jewish fighters. You can't find a Jewish fighter anymore. There were great Italian fighters, great Irish fighters, great Polish fighters. It's very hard to find those fighters. Right now, there's a whole group of Russian fighters, members of the former Soviet Union, who have come to the United States, and they're in difficult circumstances. They're producing a lot of very good boxers. I've always thought that part of the great shame and sadness of American society is that the one constant from Jack Johnson's time to today is that the greatest fighters are black fighters, almost without fail. And what that tells me is that the one group has not been able to get away from as a large unit, from the bottom rung of our society, because that is where fighters come from. There's a saying in boxing, you find no fighters wearing silk pajamas, and it is too hard a sport. The risk is too high, and the reward is too small to do this if you have any other option. And a good example, I believe, is Karl Malone. Karl Malone would have been heavyweight champion of the world in the 50s. He's a power forward now. He doesn't have to, he doesn't have to fight. And so you find almost throughout history that those whose circumstances are worse become your greatest fighters.
2 stories, both about my father, who was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, coal mining country, grew up in company housing, and that's where he learned how to box. I think I'll boil it down to one. He boxed in college when he was at Hampton Institute. and he got hit with one blow between the eyes that blacked both of his eyes. And that's when he made his firm conviction to become an accountant.
The thing about the successive waves of immigrants to America is that this really is the only route for men of color to break the cycle of poverty. The irony, again, about Jack Johnson is that this is also a man who is highly literate. He's read all of the works of Alexander Dumas. He owns patents. This is an extremely individualized person who's got the kinds of traits of a Renaissance man that we wouldn't normally associate with an athlete in the stereotype of the athlete. So he options this sort of athletic career, but he can do all of these other things.
Good evening. Part of my question was already asked, but for example, one of the things we will see in terms of how African American intellectuals and spokespersons looked at Jack Johnson, but I was particularly intrigued by the William Pickens comment. And I was wondering if any of the members of the panel would comment on Pickens' comment. And just to sum up, it was the one in which he said, for example, that in order for self-esteem for people of the race, that, for example, we might have to expend some individuals, particularly the men and women who died in the riots. And I was just wondering how you looked at his comment, and the fact that on one hand, while he's celebrating Johnson's victory, at the same time, for example, he says, for people who died in the various race riots, he said, well, that's for the better good of the race. How do you look at that comment, both in the time in which it was made, but also at least in terms of how an African-American elite was justifying, for example, let's say, someone who was rising in the sphere of athletic competition, and not necessarily in terms of with Pickens with his own background as a scholar and also later as an activist with the NAACP.
I want to bring Booker T. Washington in here because Washington was one of the black leaders you'll see in the film who basically condemned Jack Johnson, said we don't need a man like that. He doesn't reflect well on the race. Yet, on the day of that fight on July 4, 1910, Booker T. Washington arranged to have the ticker tape, blow-by-blow account of that fight brought in to Tuskegee. Now, and probably it's because he probably would have had a riot if he hadn't, because the students wanted to see it. So I guess the other thing that I think about is the poet of Jamaican ancestry, Claude McKay, who was one of the poets of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, he was responding to the race riots of 1919 during the demobilization following World War I. Now, you know, black troops fought in abjectly segregated units, if they fought at all, that is, combat. Most of the time, they were assigned to work details, dock workers, stevedores, etc. And as they came back, the job market was shrinking. Black and white soldiers were coming back. White soldiers were expecting to get the jobs they had left. And there was intense competition for jobs. And there were race riots in major cities, starting with Chicago. Black soldiers returning from the war, still in uniform, dragged off of buses, beaten, stomped, etc. So people did die. And Claude McKay wasn't so much advocating that people die, but saying his poem, if we must die, let it be like men, not like slaughtered hogs.
The reaction of the public to the championship in 1910 was similar to what we saw again when Joe Louis fought in the 30s and 40s. My father, growing up in Connecticut, and everybody referred to Lewis as the Brown Bomber, and there was nothing but pure joy whenever Lewis fought and won. And some of our colleagues at Sport and Society talk about when they were kids in Brooklyn and Harlem, hearing all the noise out on the streets after a Lewis fight, because people were just in such ecstasy over the fact that he'd conquered another opponent. And the issue of pride and hope that was representative in those heroes, I think most blacks at that point would say the folks that died in the riots didn't die in vain, because the issue was about hope. And better to have hope in a hero than no hope at all in terms of what your life might be.
The whole issue of violence, of course, is an interesting one to broach. The sport itself is a violent sport where two people are pitted against one another to see, who can get their ass whipped faster than the other.
We think it's science.
Right. And so, there's something, and that's not particularly a gender perspective. It's just violent. There's no other way around it. It's not polite like baseball where you run around in circles, but... or basketball where you run back and forth, and football where but I think that the backdrop of violence in American society is not one that we can speak enough about. Because, of course, during the whole time that Jack Johnson is reigning as the heavyweight champion and other black athletes, lynching is going on. And in New York City, the NAACP headquarters on Fifth Avenue used to hang a flag out their office window every time someone had been lynched again. The Emmett Till cases, I don't know if that's quite happened yet, but this whole backdrop of violence against black people by white people is part of what people of color in this country are weaned on. That white people are violent. And I think that it's very important to think about racism not so much as a kind of take-for-granted aspect of American cultural life. It's always going to be here, and maybe from one generation to the next it'll lessen a bit. But it really is a pathology. It's a sickness. It's a disease. And we really have to learn to look at it and treat it as if it was a medical illness. It's a disease of the soul, it's a disease of the heart, it's a disease of the mind, it's based on misinformation, and it's about human passions. But Jack Johnson is triumphing as this black demigod while black men are being lynched, let alone rioting based on whether or not he's winning or losing. And so this is going on in the lives of everyone. The same as the Rodney King incident. I mean, those sorts of incidents had gone on in African communities just before the Rodney King incident, a week after the Rodney King incident, in cities all over the United States. They get underreported. And so I think it's very important with the question that was raised that we look at the backdrop of violence in American culture. It's an extremely violent society.
We heard some clips here today from the Chicago papers and LA Times, pejorative references to blacks, and I just happened to be looking at New York Times a couple of hours ago at the library, looking at the news clips just before he won the championship and afterwards. I couldn't find a single pejorative reference, an insulting reference about Jack Johnson in the New York Times in all the articles I looked at. Indeed, there was praise for him, praise for his style, even references to whites who were fans of his in the New York Times. So that's something to feel good about, I think. And finally, when Jack Johnson finally lost to Jess Willard, there's a great deal of controversy about this fight. Do members of this panel have any thoughts on whether or not, and there has been controversy, that it was rigged with his acquiescence? And if so, this would be something that he did against the principles, his very strongly held principles of courage and honesty, or did he indeed lose this title legitimately?
They actually addressed that question, and we were talking about it before the film. personally was happy to see the way in which they did address it, in which they, for the most part, dismiss Jack Johnson's claims that he had thrown that fight. And if you have spent much of your life around boxing and you watch the film of that fight, which I've done many times, and you have some sense of what you're looking at, he was just an old champion in the long history of old champions who no longer really wanted to train. He did want to get paid, as all fighters do, and he was beaten by a younger, faster, stronger guy to whom it was more important to win at that point. And early in the fight, Jack Johnson does quite well, actually, and after it's over, and these charges first came out, Willis said, well, if he was going to quit, I wish he had done it a lot sooner because he was beating the hell out of me. But as time passed, it was 105 degrees that day. He became old overnight, which often happens in boxing, and in the end, that's how he was defeated, unable to accept it like most fighters. At the end, my good friend Evander Holyfield today has a hard time seeing what's happening to him, and we argue about it quite a lot, and he always wins the argument. But he, it's the same sort of thing. He just couldn't quite concede that.
I just want to point out that that fight was slated for 45 3-minute rounds. 45. And Jack lasted 25, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, none of the other fights that we saw described in the film was slated for that much. We heard about some 25-round fights. And so you stack the cards against the old man who hadn't trained if you're going 45. And you could say maybe Jack was foolish to do it, but he may have needed the money. Who knows? But that's 40. Can you imagine? I mean, what's the main bill? You have the minor bill is 6 rounds. The main event maximum of 15. These guys are fighting 25 and 48 rounds, and they must have been in a good deal of shape to last that long, if they lasted that long.
We're about 7 minutes after 8, so in deference to folks that would like to leave, we're going to ask the last 2 questions, and if folks still would like to stick around and talk with the panel, we'd be happy to entertain a few more questions, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time this evening. So,
thank you. I want to thank GBH, I think it's Ken Burns, and also one of the people, I guess, that sort of has gotten into the press about this is Senator McCain, who's trying to have Johnson's conviction overturned, and I commend him for that. I first learned about Jack Johnson in, I think it was 1971. Miles Davis did a score, and it was an album that he did called Jack Johnson, and I read the liner notes, and that's how, as a youngster growing up in East Harlem, I could have been, I don't want to date myself, but nonetheless, there was an edge. If you listen to Wynton Marsalis's score, which I heard the other night on GBH, and you listen to Miles Davis's score, it's kind of that we've toned it down. We've sort of gotten the edge off of what I'm going to say black people are trying to say about the injustices. You know what Miles was like in terms of how he played his music. I wonder if we could say the same thing, and this is the question that I want to put to the panelists, especially Ron. How do you see other kinds of writers or commentators or boxing experts who might have been more appropriate in terms of making comments or being in the documentary? I'm going to give you an example. What if you mentioned before, what if Don King were interviewed in the documentary, or if he made comments? What if they had Amari Baraka rather than Gerald Early or Stanley Crouch in the documentary? What do you think? Would there been a different tone to what they had to say about Jack Johnson?
Certainly, I think in the case of Don King, there would have been very much of a different tone. I've known Don for 30 years, and from basically we started together, and we blame each other for our involvement in the sport. But he's very much a historian of many things, the fights in particular, but he is a promoter. Above all else, above being black. He is a promoter, and would have fit very well back in that time. Tex Rickard promoted that fight and was it was all about the money. And with Don, it's always about the money. He, of course, promoted Muhammad Ali, some of his biggest fights, and later on was accused of stealing his money. Larry Holmes will tell you, he stole 50% of my purses, but he still paid me more than anybody else, so I made more money than I would have. But certainly there was an edge to Jack Johnson that I do think comes across in this film when you watch the whole thing. But certainly it's difficult to duplicate the hatred, I think, on the one end and the threat that he posed to people, unless you knew, as I was fortunate to do and still can say, unless you were close to Muhammad Ali and can call him your friend. Muhammad Ali, as they say in this film, and I've heard him say it, Jack Johnson's story is his story. You just remove the white women and you put religion. It's the same story. And it's about power. It's about fear of things that people don't understand. So you could, I think, in some ways do the same film around Muhammad Ali, and a lot of younger people would be much more understanding, I think, of the situation. But it's the same experience, however, 40 years later, 60 years later, almost. So things don't change, unfortunately, too much.
There were two parts to your question as I heard it. One has to do with the appropriateness of the musical score, or whether it was muted in the film. Remember that Miles Davis was writing in the late 60s and early 70s, the Black Power era. And I think that Marsalis was trying to put us in the time, late 19th and early 20th century. Black folk then had the blues. They didn't have jazz quite yet. Jazz was just crystallizing. The first, jazz record wasn't recorded until 1917, partly because black musicians didn't want to have their music frozen so some cat could cop their style. But then they realized that the first jazz record by the original Dixieland Jazz Band was a group of white guys from New Orleans. And then they said, well, hey, man, these white guys getting paid. We might as well get paid. And, of course, they almost never got paid commensurate with what the white ones got paid. They got paid $75 for a recording session with no residuals, the blues and the jazz, and the clubs they couldn't play in, so on and so forth. The other question is the talking heads. Are there some other talking heads that Ken Burns didn't tap into? And I can tell you two right now. And as I looked through the whole thing, I jotted down the names of the talking heads because I've been a talking head in some of these types of things. And the two people that I thought were the most logical ones weren't there. Jeffrey T. Sammons, who was a professor at New York University, he wrote a book called Beyond the Ring, The Role of Boxing in American Society. And he's got a chapter on Jack Johnson. And then the other person is Al Tony Gilmore, another formerly trained African-American historian whose dissertation and subsequent book published in 1975 was about Jack Johnson, and the title of it was Bad Nigger. Now, I don't know whether Al Tony is out of jail yet. No, it's funny, but Al Tony later was the director of the Black Studies program at the University of Maryland, College Park, and was doing some funny stuff with assistantships, kickback schemes and so on, and so he served a little time. Now, I don't know whether he's still in jail.
Yeah, come on, Bob.
Hi, my name is Philip Roberts. I work with City here, and I was just curious, Jack Johnson and boxers like Reuben Carter, like I'm sure everyone's familiar with him, and how like they like kind of like fight, like, you know, they were living in times where the white community did not like the black community, and, you know, it was separated, just a lot of segregation, and they were still doing their thing like in the ring. But like, how come you kind of never, like, when you hear like civil rights, like, do you think the African community looked up to these men like as heroes, just as like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X was like civil rights? And like, how come you never really hear their names when people talk about civil rights? Because
we were talking earlier about the fact that despite that the fact that Jack Johnson is hated by the white community, he manages to live until he crashes his car into a tree. And why is it that even though there were attempts on his life, as you've seen in the small vignette here, why was no one successful at bringing him down and taking him out in that sign of? And so there is this aspect of boxing in which boxing becomes the pinnacle of masculinity for America, as well as whether it's black America or white America. And this notion that these figures are so larger than life and so intimidating that we push to see more of them regardless of their race. We have more not more, I guess the new phenomena that's occurred is you've got lots of women in boxing now. That's something that probably would have sent a shiver up Jack Johnson's spine. And a lot of people from that era, that generation. But there's something that we hold sacred about the demigods of athletics that we set up, and I think they just are very, very intimidating for all of us. That they intimidate us into complacency, they intimidate us to awe, they intimidate us to love and hate them at the same time. And so we want them there. We hold them up as kind of sacred cows of American culture, and we have all types of them now in all sports, male and female.
I'd like to thank our panelists for a wonderful dialogue, and thank you all for coming. And on behalf of Northeastern University, the Ford Hall Forum, WDBH, and the Institute for Race and Justice, we want to thank you all for coming out tonight and supporting this event, and we hope that you'll watch the two-part series on Jack Johnson this Monday and Tuesday evening on Channel 2. Have a good evening and travel safe.